98 M Roadster, 58,000 miles. Front strut. It's not that bad. Not terrible, at least. So, first things, sway bar, end link, goes through there. That was a 16 millimeter. That was the first thing I did. Had to actually pry down here on the sway bar itself to be able to get it out. Because, yeah, you can see it's risen up a little bit under a load. So you've got a brake pad sensor and I believe a speed sensor that go through this plastic clip right here. That comes off and goes on the other strut. Then you've got on the other side of the strut, you've got this housing, this fitment on the strut itself that holds your brake hydraulic line and your two sensor lines just fitted in those slots there. Then you've got a 18 millimeter nut and bolt that go through right there. They look like this. Then you've got 18 millimeter bolts that used to live here that actually go through the bottom of the strut. I would advise, because there is a thread lock on these, go easy. What I did was I got it started, got it out just maybe a 1/16 of an inch, maybe like, you know, where the washer is to the head. Squirted some WD-40 down on it, then tightened it back up, and I went half a turn out, quarter turn back, and I gingered it out so that I didn't booger up the threads. I actually used a breaker bar, then I ended up going to the ratchet because you don't want to smoke the threads. Then the other fasteners that you've got are up top on the strut tower. These are 14s, and you just make sure you've got a jack stand holding your rotor and your hub and your caliper. Keep another one close by just in case you need something to cross brace. But you want to remove the strut and fish it out, obviously without damaging any of your sensor lines. And that's pretty much the process. I've already done the other side just to give you an example of what they look like. I mean, I'm able to pull and yeah, they were smoked. The rear were just like that, so highly recommend replacing them. But it's not that bad of a job. A small little pry bar works pretty good in this space here to pry the strut off of that ear. But before I did that, I took two of them out and I loosened the third so that I had a little wiggle. And then the other thing is you want to take your lines and make sure you put them above that sway bar link ear to make sure that it doesn't tear any of that stuff up. Then I'm just gonna ginger it out the bottom. It's resting on the tie rod right now, but just another tidbit. Because I'm doing this with an iPhone, it's kind of tough to show, but what I did was I pulled this out this way. So what I did was I dropped it down, as I said, on the tie rod. And then because it's, you know, it's a bearing in there, you know, this pivots. So you can turn the strut the way that you want to fish it out, get it down low enough. And then I just pulled it out this way so that I didn't damage any of my connections and cables. So, well, sensor lines. So at any rate, it's out. This is what it looks like. Again, because I'm doing this with an iPhone, it's kind of tough, but you got spring compression tools. You got to compress the spring. So I'm going to compress the spring because you do not want to just take that cap off here and take that nut off, because it'll it'll projectile that direction. At any rate, just another tidbit. So I've compressed my spring, and you can see that I've got this spring. There's no tension on the spring. So I use my spring compression tools to compress it. And now I've taken that cover off and the little plastic cap, and I'll take that 22mm bolt out, nut out, and then I'll separate the components. And it is very important, obviously, to make sure that the sequence of those parts are, you know, kind of laid out so that you put them back the same way. One more detail, put a vice grip on that shaft. It's going to turn to be able to get that nut off. Okay, 22mm, and leave the compression tools on your spring. You're going to need them to put the new one on. Going with the Bilstein B6. Not going to lower. I'm going with the stock springs. I'm an old man. Getting out of this thing is not going to get any easier over the years. Okay, the sequence of this is, there is this tapered stay that goes on the stock piece, but the Bilstein just has a flat perch that's part of the shaft. So there's your nut that came out of the top. There is a washer that is underneath it. Again, with an iPhone, one hand, I'm gonna just dump this stuff out. I use that washer that goes on top of the bearing. I reuse that, so I clean that. There's your bearing, no shield left. And on the bottom here, got this neat little cover that you don't want to reuse that. I got new ones, but they go on the back side of the bearing because that is a pivot. See how it's tapered? Is a pivot point for the bottom of the mount. It rides on this surface here, this pivot, or yeah, it pivots on top of that because that bearing allows the whole strut to turn with the turning of the steering wheel. So I'm going to reuse my rubbers because they're pretty good. And then you just clean these plates out. But you want to make sure that you go back in the sequence that it came off and you reuse just plate, this washer. I'm going to reuse that on top. I went with KYB mounts. Okay, reversing the sequence. Got the B6 routed through, cleaned up my spring perch, lined up my rubber and my spring in the bottom, lined up, there. I'll turn that to where it lines up right there with the spring. Reusing that washer there. I'm not reusing the bottom cap washer that goes right there. That is, I tore the bag, but there's the part number. And then, of course, your nut. So the sequence is just put it back together. So I got the spring and the right part there. Got it. I'll line it up here. I'll turn it a little bit. And then you've got the washer on top, threads exposed. You are going to need a suspension type socket and ratchet with a 6mm Allen on another ratchet, because the way that you have to do this is the Allen wrench locks the shaft from turning like I did earlier with the vice grips, because I don't care about that because I'm taking it off. But this is the way that you tighten that down to the proper position. So this is the way this works. I am turning the nut in while I'm locking the shaft in place. The other thing you want to make sure of is that your spring is positioned correctly there, and it is positioned correctly in the new strut while you're doing this. When complete, what you end up is you bottom out the nut. There's a torque, but I can't get a torque wrench that has a mechanism like this to where I can stick a 6mm Allen through it. So I just got it as tight as I could get it. And what you end up with is you end up with a nice smooth moving rotating assembly that pivots on the joint and washer. Then you reverse the clamps, take tension, put it back on the spring. Once you got it back in its original position, you got this reinforcement plate, goes in the top, new gasket. What's interesting is this car didn't have a gasket. I'm not the original owner, but I'm pretty sure those are definitely, well, Vogue. Interesting. M Roadster, made in Germany, BMW. They're original. Goes back on there like so. Had to use the micro adjustment tool to tap the rotor to get that joint put together, to get the bolt and nut through it, or the bolt through it. Working on the bottom 18s now. Just moved my jack stand out of the way to tilt this to get that closer, and then these are just finger tight in. Don't forget this little retaining clip that goes back on this threaded stock here. Recapping, so put the plastic connector or clip piece back on, routed these back around, fed them into those grooves, all nice and tidy. Put brake sensor back through the bleeder valve cap. Got my 18 bolt nut combo there. Got my 18 there. My 18 there. Up top, these change from 14s to 13s with the B6. Got my gasket in between my reinforcement plate. Got my nut cap back on. These are torqued at 16. These are torqued at 78. So I'll torque them up, put the wheel back on, call it done. Oh, no, still got that. That's a little bit of a challenge because you have to pry down on the sway bar here to get it down, to get this right here in that hole. So I took a pry bar, pried down on the sway bar up against that frame mount to get it to where I can get it down to where I can get that sway bar end link through there. I'll put the nut on that, tighten that up. There's it takes a 16mm on the back side to keep this from turning when you fasten it. So there's two flats on the back side of that sway bar end link, 16mm wrench, 16mm socket, tighten that up.